The United States is currently embroiled in a process to impeach the president, Donald J. Trump. Normally, when someone commits a crime or abuses their position, there is some kind of oversight which kicks in and can suspend the perpetrator from their office. For lawyers, that's the state bar, or the court's grievance committee, like we saw when Judge Siebel referred Attorney Richard Leibowitz for disciplinary action for lying about his grandfather's death. In the U.S., we have checks and balances on each branch's power provided through operation of the U.S. Constitution. For the most part, Congress makes the laws through bicameralism and presentment, that is, the House and Senate must agree by simple majority on new laws which are presented to the President for approval or veto. The President is charged with faithfully executing the laws as written, with acting as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, and with overseeing international relations. The judiciary, including the Supreme Court, hears cases and controversies brought before it. In the context of checks and balances, the courts will interpret the laws and issue orders to parties in court matters, including representatives from the legislative or executive branches, orders that require them to act within the powers granted by the Constitution and the laws. But impeachment of a president is different. There are no police or district attorneys or U.S. attorneys to charge them with federal crimes. Instead, the U.S. Constitution only provides for the impeachment process as a way to address the problem presented by a president who is acting outside the law. The U.S. House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment, and the Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments, according to the text of the U.S. Constitution. A president that is impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate shall be removed from office, disqualified to hold further office, and may be subject to further prosecution or indictment. Impeachable offenses are enumerated explicitly in the U.S. Constitution. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment and conviction for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. The U.S. Constitution is a 250-year-old document that requires some understanding of history to conclude its meaning. Impeachment is not just for actual crimes, but also for abuse of the trust of public office, such as using a public position for personal gain. How would you feel if you hired an attorney to represent you and they instead worked against your best interests because there was more money in it for them? How would you feel if you were thrown in jail by a judge who was being bribed by a prison to send more inmates? That last one recently happened, by the way, and former judges Mark Civarella and Michael Conahan were convicted of sending kids to jail in return for cash from the prisons. But how do you hold the U.S. president accountable for their actions? It gets complicated and quickly. The U.S. Constitution is silent on what an impeachment trial is supposed to look like, what the rules are, whether it follows court procedures, and whether witnesses and testimony are required. And that complication is exactly what's happening with Donald Trump's impeachment. The House charged him with 2 articles of impeachment, namely that the president abused his power when he requested Ukraine announce an investigation of his political rival, Joe Biden, or else the president would, and did, withhold $391 million in aid for Ukraine that had been provided by the U.S. Congress. Remember when I said the U.S. president is required to faithfully execute the laws? Well, the law said that Ukraine gets the aid. Trump added the conditions to serve himself. The second article of impeachment charges Trump with obstruction of Congress by ordering his administration not to respond to lawful subpoenas from Congress. Congress has the sole power of impeachment and removal, and that means issuing subpoenas for documents and testimony so that Congress can investigate and evaluate their case. By refusing to answer questions or provide documents, the U.S. president has substituted himself for Congress, overstepping the powers granted to the president by the U.S. Constitution in violation of the checks and balances provided. None of this is very simple, and then you add politics into this. The Democrats see the matter one way. The president clearly violated the law, his oath of public office, and the public trust by using his constitutional powers for personal gain. He did not faithfully execute the laws of the United States. This is very similar to the 1998 impeachment of President Bill Clinton, who lied under oath about very personal relations with Monica Lewinsky, a member of his staff. Trump's strategy for comparison is similar to what I tell my clients when they are guilty as heck. Don't let them get you under oath. For Republicans, the matter is characterized as a witch hunt, a political scheme to undermine the president they so obviously support. Senators Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, among others, have even publicly stated that they will not be impartial triers of the president's impeachment, which is required by the U.S. Constitution's clause requiring senators trying impeachment offenses to be on oath or affirmation that they will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws. Despite the oath, they are currently presiding over the impeachment trial. Another controversy of the Trump impeachment trial is that the Senate has blocked the testimony of witnesses or the introduction of evidence, things that are normal in court and guaranteed by the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In Nixon v. United States, not that Nixon, but rather Mississippi District Court Judge Walter Nixon, in 1993, Justice Byron White wrote in a concurring opinion that impeachment is generally a non-justiciable issue because the Senate has wide discretion in specifying impeachment trial procedures and because it is extremely unlikely that the Senate would abuse its discretion and insist on a procedure that could not be deemed a trial by reasonable judges. Though Justice White isn't with us today, what we U.S. citizens do have is 4 Democrat-nominated justices and 5 Republican-nominated justices. One of the Republican-nominated justices is Chief Judge John Roberts, who is charged with presiding over the Senate's impeachment trial of Donald Trump. If, and this is a big if there was a court challenge over whether the Senate's impeachment trial was outside of what the U.S. Constitution allows, in other words, if it was challenged as not being a trial, but rather something less or something else, then the U.S. Supreme Court could eventually receive the case, likely after rulings before the D.C. Federal District Court and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The challenge would be on the grounds that McConnell, Graham, and others publicly announced that they would not be impartial, or on the grounds that a trial without witnesses and evidence is not a trial. As Justice White wrote, if the Senate were to act in a manner seriously threatening the integrity of its results, convicting, say, upon a coin toss or upon a summary determination that an officer of the United States was simply a bad guy, judicial interference might well be appropriate. Well, if this went to the Supreme Court, there's a good chance that the court would see this as a non-justiciable political issue and refuse to adjudicate any complaint at all. Courts hate to get involved in political decisions. It's reported that Justice David Souter wept when he realized the Supreme Court would need to resolve the 2000 election in Bush v. Gore. But there's also a possibility that the court could order the matter back to the Senate for a proper trial, including evidence, testimony, and impartial jurors. Since the Supreme Court doesn't like to tell other branches what to do, it would likely issue a narrow decision that simply sent the matter back to the Senate with orders to conduct the trial in a constitutionally sound fashion. But wait, you might say, there are 5 Republican-nominated justices and 4 Democrat-nominated justices on the Supreme Court. That's 5-4 if they vote along party lines. Well, first, we can't count on the Supreme Court justices simply doing one party's bidding. Many justices have ruled against the very administrations that nominated them. But let's say, hypothetically, that might happen. Remember I said that Chief Justice John Roberts was presiding over the impeachment trial? That means he'd have to recuse himself from the Supreme Court's consideration of any impeachment trial challenge due to the conflict of interest created by his presiding over the allegedly unimpartial Senate trial itself. That means there's a slim chance we could see a 4-4 tie between the justices. What happens then? Well, there's very little in the text of the U.S. Constitution. It only addresses the powers of the Supreme Court itself. The lower courts were created by acts of Congress. And there's very little case law because we really haven't been in this situation as a country before. So here is a fun hypothetical. When impeachment isn't the issue, a tie at the Supreme Court, such as a 4-4 decision, acts as an affirmation of the lower court's ruling, which becomes a binding but non-precedential decision. An impeachment challenge would likely need to work its way up from the D.C. Federal District Court, then the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and then finally to the U.S. Supreme Court. That means that a 4-4 tie at the U.S. Supreme Court would fall back to the D.C. Circuit Court appellate decision, a decision made by the entire D.C. Circuit Court, all 11 active judges. One of those judges was appointed for a Supreme Court seat during the last year of the Obama administration, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to hold confirmation hearings as set forth in the U.S. Constitution. That's the same Mitch McConnell who publicly stated he would not be impartial during the impeachment trial. And that judge, who was refused confirmation, is none other than Chief D.C. Appellate Justice Merrick Garland.